וידבר אדוני אל משה בהר סיני לאמור, דבר אל בני ישראל ואמרת עליהם, כי סבאו אל הארץ אשר אני נושאין לכם, ושבסה הארץ שבוס לאדוני. אם בחוקותיי תלכו ויש מצוותיי תשמרו, ועשיתם אותם, ונשאתי גשמיכם בעיתם, ונשאנה הארץ יבולה, ואת השדה ייתן פריהו.
This week's Torah portion includes two short parashot that conclude the book of Leviticus, Parasha Behar and Parasha Bechukotai. Again, God speaks to Moses from the Mount Sinai. That's what starts the Parashat Behar, and talks about the Sabbath year and the year of Jubilees. Both of this seventh year and a seventh year after the 7-year cycles indicate the intent of God to train people on the meaning of the Sabbath that has not only the historical meaning as the seventh day of creation, but the eschatological meaning. Everyone who got poor and sold himself into the slavery works only 6 years, and on the 7th year is released. On the year of Jubilee, every debt is forgiven. On the 7th year, the land is resting, and everything which grows on it becomes available for everyone who goes around. This is the idea to show the reliance of God, on God, particularly when God says in the same manner as He said about manna, I am going to give you for Friday the double portion, so don't go out and don't pick up the manna on the Sabbath. And then the same idea here in the Sabbath year. Don't worry, on the 6th year, I'm going to give you such a harvest that you won't need to worry about your sustenance on a 7th year. That's the lesson God is teaching His people, to rely on Him. And that is true because God is sending people to the land where people have to rely on Him, because He is the source of rain. He shows the contrast between Him, the Creator, who actually is bringing forth bread from the ground, and the pagan gods. It appears that the idea of the traditional Jewish blessing on the bread, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, amotzi lechem min haaretz, the one, blessed are you, Lord God, King of the universe, who brings forth the bread from the ground. This is the idea of God, the sustainer. The same idea is involved in the table of the showbread, where the bread is laid out every week and is picked up on a Sabbath and eaten by the priests. This showbread idea differs in the opposite fashion with the pagan idea of feeding the deity. The traditional Babylonian story of creation shows that God created humans so that humans would feed them. In Psalm 50, God says, if I was hungry, I wouldn't ask you, because everything belongs to me. God is the sustainer of His people. And the idea of the sabbatical year is to show that the blessings, material blessing, the sustenance, comes from the Lord. And these two parashot make a nice conclusion of the covenant procedure which was going on a Mount Sinai for over a year. When people approached the Mount Sinai, upon the approach to the mountain, God gave them manna. And then the Sabbath idea comes with it. That's the first time the Sabbath commandment is particularly mentioned with the context of sustenance. And then people approached the Mount Sinai, and God talks to them and says, if you keep my commandment, you will be my portion. You will be my selected, chosen people. This was a preamble to the covenant which God has established with his people on the Mount Sinai. The covenant that had, of course, the conditions attached. And the conditions of the covenant, if you keep my commandment, I will give you the blessings. The conclusion portion of the book of Leviticus returns back to the same theme, starting with the theme of the Sabbath. It picks up in Behar Bechukotai on a theme of the covenant. And that's why the parasha is called Bechukotai, because in Leviticus chapter 26, verse 3, it says, if you walk in my statutes and keep my commandments. Hukah is the statute or the ordinance. But again, the chapter 26 begins with two statements, a reiteration of the Decalogue. You shall not make yourself an idols, and you shall keep my Sabbath and reverence my sanctuary. I am the Lord. And then God pronounces the blessings which people of God will reap if they continue walk in the statutes of God. And the blessings include, first of all, the economy. I will give you rains in their season, so that the land will yield its produce, and the trees of the field will bear their fruit. The land of Canaan is very particularly dependent upon the rains. In fact, the water is never extra blessing there. It is not like in some of the areas of the United States, for example, in Illinois and Iowa, when there was a flood, and the flood destroyed the corn crop. The sand, the soil in Canaan is very particular. It's very absorbent. In fact, during the winter time, there is a downpour of rains, so that the effects of these downpours are visible when we drive along the shore of the Dead Sea. We see all kinds of crevices and mountains, and that create wadis. Wadi is the dried out riverbed, because the water in that riverbed is only happening in the winter time, when the rains just literally flood the area. And when the rains are abundant, they have to close the road that leads along the Dead Sea shore toward Eilat and Beersheba. But this abundance of rain means that that the land will give its fruit. It will yield well. And on the opposite, on the contrary, when I visited Jordan, I saw how some of the farmers suffer without the sufficient waters. I saw one farmer who had a tomato plant in his garden, and there was a tomato very large like this. It's called a bull heart, very juicy, and it was not ripe, and it was sitting on the ground and rotten because there was no water. The water was so expensive that the farmer could not afford to water his garden, because of course he had a sheep and he had his own needs, and that's how the things can turn sour if the water is not sufficient. But God said, if you keep my commandments, I will provide sufficient rain. I control the climate. I will provide sufficient rain. And that's again, it's connected with the previous parasha, Behar, when he says, on the 6th year, I'm going to give you so much that even your 8th year will suffice you in the food. And that's why it says here in verse 5, indeed your threshing will last for you until the grape gathering, and a grape gathering will last until the sowing time, which means that the harvest will be in such abundance that when after the Shavuot they would reap the wheat and the grains, it would take them that long time, entire summer, to thresh the grain. And then they would start reaping the grapes and olives, and they would have to skip their vacation and then start sowing the barley in the beginning of the rainy season. Of course, that's an exaggeration, but it shows, in fact, that God has followed through in what he promises. At the time of the Solomon, the economy was so strong that Solomon had started building the fleet of the trade ships, and he would send the ships that would bring him gold and all kinds of luxury stuff. And the only thing Israel literally is able to export was the food. It means that during the Solomon's time, after the end of the reign of David, God actually followed through, and the nation was really blessed economically. And then, of course, the second promise, I shall grant peace to the land, which is definitely important. No aggressor would attack you, and if somebody attacks you, you would be able to defend and chase them away. In fact, again, the illustration is that during the reign of Solomon, there was no wars. Even the rabbis in Leviticus Rabbah, they talk about the origins of the name Shlomo, the Solomon in English, and they say Shlomo means shalom shelo, means peace to him. That is an interesting analysis here, which shows that God really follows through with his blessings. And of course, then it says at the end, I will also walk among you and be your God, and you shall be my people. God promises to keep his dwelling place, to reside among his people. And definitely, if we see again the golden age of Solomon, that was true. When Solomon finished construction of the temple, which he could afford with that economy, because he was able to purchase the cedars from Lebanon and all precious materials, because definitely there was no opportunity to rob Egyptians at this time. And people would come and they would watch the temple. And we know the Queen of Sheba story, where she really was impressed with what was happening. So God shows in history that he would make good on his promises. But if the people would reject the covenant, if they would not follow the laws, and they would be disobedient to God, the consequences would also exist, and they would be multi-stepped. Every time it says, I will, but if they do not obey me and do not carry out these commandments, if instead you reject my statutes, and if your soul abhors my ordinance, I will turn and do this to you. I'll appoint over you a sudden terror, consumption, and fever. It is interesting how God is talking about the health issue. And then if you again turn your face against me, the next step of curse comes and your economy falls apart. And then it goes on and on. This is very interesting, because that's exactly what is happening when we look at the prophetic literature. The prophetic literature of the Hebrew Bible has two sections. Basically, the book of Joshua was written by the prophet. The book of Judges and Samuel was written by Samuel. And then, of course, the book of Kings were written by Jeremiah. And that's why they're considered to be prophetic. But also Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the book of 12, they create another section of the Nevi'im. What is happening here? In the historical section of Nevi'im, we have actually the analysis of how people of Israel actually followed the commandments and were faithful to the covenant. While in the book of prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12, we have the prophet coming out and saying, okay, God is gonna sue you for rejecting the covenant, because you reject the covenant. And usually, like the prophet Isaiah, the book of Isaiah and the book of Jeremiah and Ezekiel, they have like two parts in them: the doom and the consolation. While the doom is a part which talks about the rejection of the covenant, the consolation usually shows how God is able to restore the blessing. And especially in the book of Isaiah and the book of Ezekiel, we see how these books are structured in the same fashion as Leviticus 26, but backwards. The curses, the promise of curses, the prediction of all the problems which Israel has will come first, while the promise of blessings will come next. The issue of conditionality of the covenant had a very serious effect on the Christian theology. Because in a Christian theology, there are two extremes. Extreme number one says that Israel always remains chosen people by God, and they have a special place. In some places, even in some Messianic congregations, where there are Jewish members and non-Jewish members, it appears that the Jewish members are considered to be a people of a higher class. While on the other hand, the replacement theology, which originates from Augustinian works, always emphasizes the conditionality and the rejection of Israel. In other words, it says, the Augustinian theology says, Israel did not follow the commandments of God. Israel did not keep the covenant, and that's why God rejected them. Now we have new Israel, which is the church. One of the characteristics of this conclusion chapter of the book of Leviticus is God's grace, which is also part of the equation. In Leviticus 26, verse 45 and 46, it says clearly, "But I will remember for them the covenant with their ancestors, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt in the sight of the nations, that I might be their God. I am the Lord." And it says here in verse 42 again, "Then I will remember my covenant with Jacob." And in verse 42, it's very clear that God is talking about his remembrance of the covenant after the final punishment. And the final punishment is a scattering of the people of Israel all across the land. And it ends with verse 35, where it says, "All these days of its desolation, the land, it will observe the rest," or the Sabbath, "which it did not observe on your Sabbath." And then God comes back, "But I'll still remember my covenant." Because God is the God of love and God of grace and God of compassion. And his compassion always wins, because the message of grace is not only to the Christians, but it is also to the Jews. And this is why Jeremiah chapter 32 deals with that, when God commands his prophet right in the middle of the destruction of Jerusalem, when the army of Nebuchadnezzar surrounds the walls of Jerusalem, and when everybody is trying to find food, when everybody is almost ready to eat each other, and cannibalism is rampantly growing, God comes to Jeremiah and said, "Go to that potter and buy his field." Of course, it makes absolutely no sense. The city is doomed, and whatever Jeremiah buys will not be his. In fact, that potter will be absolutely thrilled to sell the land. But the idea that behind it, of course, is that Jeremiah says, and the people will return back, and they'll be able to buy the land again, because I am the Lord. I punish, but I also am a gracious God. And the reason for it is very simple. Yes, the covenant has conditions attached. And yes, not always the nation of Israel follows the covenant. Although if we look at the history of Israel during the kings, the time of kings and the time of Samuel, we will discover, even if we add the time of Judges, we will discover that the entire history of Israel from 1400 BCE to 586 BCE, where the destruction of Jerusalem, we have only a 20% of time described when Israel has rejected or apostatized. But the rest of the 80% was fine. The problem is that the prophets aren't really needed when everything is good. And we make a wrong conclusion based on the Bible that every time Israel is doing bad. No. When everything is good, God doesn't need the prophet. When Isaiah made his message clear and finally Hezekiah started to follow the covenant, God has restored his blessing, destroyed the Assyrian army, and there was no need for the prophet. And of course, during the Josiah time, the reforms, there was no need for the prophet. But at the end of the reign of Josiah, God raised Jeremiah because the situation became sour, especially under the reign of Jehoiachin and Jehoiakim and Zedekiah that brought Jerusalem to destruction. So we got to be careful when we analyze the history of Israel. And even though rabbis often overdo it on the other end, trying to find any possible justification sometimes for the action of Israel, nevertheless, we have to be balanced, We have to be really analytical in trying to see what was going on. And this is why in the book of Jeremiah, we have this promise of God to return, because there is always people who follow God. And this is why the book of Romans, chapter 11, is very clear on the matter of rejection of Israel, asking directly in Romans chapter 11, verse 1, I say then, God has not rejected his people, has he? May it never be. It's a New American Standard Bible translated in very forceful language. And the reason for it is very simple. By believing that the people of Israel are rejected, Christianity destroys its foundation. Because the foundation of real Christian faith is in the Scripture. And the Reformation has tried to return Christianity to the Scripture, which is based on the Hebrew Scriptures and Hebrew writings. And this is why Paul is very objective when he says in the book of Romans chapter 3, then what's the advantage has the Jew, or what's the benefit of circumcision? Great in every respect. First of all, that they are entrusted with the oracles or the words of God.